Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 9 for History 102. And what we want to pick up with first here is the election of 1872. Now, Grant is going to run for re-election, and the Republicans believe that he's pretty vulnerable, and because of all the corruption that surrounded him by this point, including having to pick a different vice presidential candidate when Skylar Colfax went up in flames with the Credit Mobilier scandal. So the Democrats are going to nominate a reform candidate, and his name is Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was the editor of the New York Tribune, very well known not only in New York but around the country, and seen as an honest reformer and a big defender of the Constitution. So, in this election, which will be hotly contested and quite frankly a pretty dirty election, people think that dirty politics and negative campaigning is something that's a modern phenomenon in America, but it's been going on for a long, long time, dating all the way back to the early 1800s. Dirty politics is what caused the duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. So, This is a mud-spattered campaign. The Republicans are going to try to paint out a very poor picture of an honest candidate, which isn't easy to do. They're going to make all sorts of attacks against him, that he's, a member of a free love commune. He's a vegetarian, I guess, which was a mark against you back then. And they're also going to make a big deal out of the fact that he was a co-signer of Jefferson Davis's bail bond. Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, after the Civil War was captured. He was trying to escape the country, granted, and make it to Mexico because he feared he'd be brought up on war crime charges. So he was arrested and he was placed in prison, and he stayed there nearly 2 years, and they never charged him with anything, which in the United States you can't do. If you're going to keep a person in jail, you have to charge them with the crime, then try them and allow them to prove themselves not guilty. So, Horace Greeley and others led the charge in defense of the Constitution, basically saying, there's such a thing here as a writ of habeas corpus. Charge him or release him. So, they're going to end up compromising and releasing him on bail. Horace Greeley will be one of those that guarantees if he ever does have to stand trial, he will be there. He's not going to flee the country. That's a black mark against you when you're doing this in support of the former president of the Confederacy. Greeley was doing this in support of law and the Constitution, but they're going to use it against him. Now, the Democrats are going to basically try to paint Grant as this corrupt individual, surrounded at least by corrupt individuals, who is in the White House, and they're also going to make wild claims that he's a drunk and all this other nonsense. So it's a real mud-spattered campaign. But when the votes are tallied up, Grant's going to win pretty handily. He'll win by more than 400,000 votes, which, basically he'll win by twice the margin that he won in 1868. Which is pretty surprising with all this baggage attached to him. The reason why? The Force Acts had been passed. There were federal officials. The Army was down there escorting black voters to the polls in 1872. The Ku Klux Klan was under control. This really shows us the effect that they had on that election in 1868. So, Grant wins re-election, takes office in March of 1873 to start serving his second term. Back in this day and age, Inauguration Day wasn't until March. Unlike today, it's on January 20th, but that's not going to change until 1937, FDR's second inauguration. They'll change the date. And almost immediately after he's sworn in for his second term, a panic hits America. Now, a panic in the 19th century is what we called either depressions or recessions. Economics wasn't sophisticated enough to term something, a depression, a recession, whatnot. They were known as panics, due in part to the fact that people would literally panic and rush down and take all their money out of the bank in fears that the bank would close. And if a bank closed back in this day and age and you had money in it, kiss it goodbye. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures our bank deposits today, was not created until 1933 during the Great Depression. It was one of FDR's New Deal programs. So this is going to be your typical post-war depression. It was pretty severe. And this can happen after war because the economy gets so accustomed to depending upon war orders to fuel it. Now, 50,000 businesses will go bankrupt. There'll be unemployment riots in New York City. And one of the things that magnified the nature of this post-war depression was that the national bank system was trying to come up with the proper amount of paper versus hard money, as it's known, in circulation in the United States. Hard money back then is money actually made out of gold and silver. Back in the 19th century, you had silver dollars, which had approximately an ounce of silver contained in them. You had $5, $10, $20 gold pieces that, obviously contained, a $20 gold piece contains about an ounce of gold. So they're trying to figure out the proper balance because during the Civil War, they withdrew all hard money out of circulation and replaced it with paper because they did not want the hard money falling to the hands of the Confederates. Now they're trying to figure out the delicate balance because you also remember when we talked about cornering the gold market, back in this day and age you had a gold standard and you had to back your money with gold. This was a mess and it amplified this panic of 1873. So Grant's basically going to spend his second term trying to revive the economy. So, 1876 rolls around, and it's time for another election. And initially, Grant toyed around with the idea of running for a completely unprecedented third term. George Washington set the tradition with his farewell address, and no president since, Washington only served 2 terms. In his farewell address, he basically said 2 terms for any president is enough. We need, fresh ideas, a new administration at least every 8 years. And people had followed his lead. Grant thought about it, but then his advisors quickly reminded him, you know what will happen if you do try to break the tradition and run for a third term. Everyone will say that you believe you're greater than George Washington. And one of his advisors flat out asked him, sir, Do you think you're greater than George Washington? And Grant said, no, I do not. So I'm not running for a third term. Washington's tradition will not be broken until 1940 when FDR runs for an unprecedented third term in the middle of World War I. That's how long that tradition is going to last. So we have a wide open election. So the Republicans are going to sort of come up with a formula for success in presidential elections during the Gilded Age. And that formula is find a former Union officer from the state of Ohio. And it's going to end up being a winning formula, as you'll see. The reason why it works, obviously the country's still torn by the war. But Ohio, back in this day and age, is what's known as a swing state. Swing states, today, we refer to them politically as battleground states. You'll hear a lot about that in this upcoming election. Back in the old days, we called them swing states. What it meant was they could swing from election to election, that they were almost equally divided between Democrats and Republicans. So one election they might vote for a Democratic candidate for the presidency. Next election they might vote for a Republican. They swung back and forth. So to guarantee that you won Ohio, which was at this point in history the third largest prize in the Electoral College, only behind New York and Pennsylvania, you picked a candidate from there. So they're going to nominate the three-time governor and officer from the Civil War, Rutherford B. Hayes, as their candidate. Nobody had really heard of him nationally, but he fit their strategy bill, being a Union officer from Ohio. And he's going to win his home state, obviously. The Democrats will counter with somebody who has really made a name for himself and is seen as a real honest, straight shooter. That's New York City prosecutor Sam Tilden, the man who threw Tweed in prison. So this is going to be a hotly contested election. And when the results all come in, basically nobody wins. To win the election, it requires 185 Electoral College votes. Here's what's going to happen, and I'm going to post in this module some diagrams that show the results of the election and how this all pans out. So make sure and click on those links, take a look at them. It'll help explain this. You may want to have it in front of you when you listen to this. Anyway, 3 states had disputed results, meaning when they counted up the votes, if Democrat officials counted them in that state, Tilden won. If Republican officials counted them in that state, Hayes won. The 3 states in question were South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Now, so they can't make up their minds. They just argue about it. Kind of ironic. Florida has a long-standing tradition of having a difficult time counting votes. It was the centerpiece of the 2000 election controversy. I'll be surprised if it's not in this coming election. But anyway, what they're going to end up doing is sending 2 sets of returns to Congress. Because what happens after an election, in December, Congress will open up all these envelopes from the states that will report, okay, this person won our state, so they get all the Electoral College votes from our state, and so award those to this candidate. Then they count them all up, and when somebody gets 185 or more Electoral College votes, they're declared president officially in Congress. Well, without these states reporting who won or lost, Sam Tilden has 184 Electoral College votes. there's going to be 20 disputed. In order to win the election, Hayes will need all 20 of those Electoral College votes, which would give him a victory, 185 to 184. Tilden just has to be declared winner in one of those states, and he wins. Now, so what they do is they send 2 sets of returns to Congress. So when it gets to the point where they're going to open up Florida's return, vote, there's 2 envelopes. There's not supposed to be 2 envelopes. It's supposed to be 1 saying this person won, they get our Electoral College votes. Congress doesn't know what to do. There's no, accommodation for what do you do if you get 2 envelopes from one state? Which one do you open? So, what they're going to end up doing is arguing about it for quite some time. Then they're going to create an Electoral Commission. They're going to make this commission have 15 members. Now, 7 of the members on this commission will be Democrats from the House or Senate. The other 7 of the members will be Republicans from the House or Senate. The 15th member of this commission will be a Supreme Court Justice by the name of David Davis. The reason why they pick him is he's seen as truly a neutral person. He's let it be known quite, several times since he's been on the court. I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican. I answer to the Constitution, which is the way that Supreme Court justices are supposed to be. So, here's what happens the first time they have a meeting of this special electoral commission to decide basically what envelopes do we open. Supreme Court Justice David Davis, a little bit late. He's got to rush from across the street from the Supreme Court to the halls of the Capitol. Comes into the conference room where they're meeting, and he immediately figures out what the hell's going on. Seated on one side of the room are the 7 Democrats. Seated on the other side of the room are the 7 Republicans. He figures out, aha, you've selected me to pick the next president of the United States. I'm going to be the determining vote. I know how you 7 are going to vote. I know how you 7 are going to vote. He immediately resigns and says, I will not pick the president of the United States. Voters are supposed to do that, and I'm not going to be put in that position. So now they're stuck. Time's ticking away. Inauguration, remember, is in early March. Just 2 days before the inauguration, they reach a compromise, which becomes known as the Compromise of 1877. Now, the main outcome of this compromise is the envelopes are going to open are the Republican versions of what happened in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. So, Hayes will get all those Electoral College votes. Hayes will win the presidency by 1 Electoral College vote. Now, before I talk about the other aspects of what's in this compromise, we need to talk about how ridiculous it is. When you look at the map I'm going to scan for you, you'll notice the breakdown of Democrat and Republican states and so forth, and where Tilden won all the states, and where Hayes won. There was absolutely no way a Republican Union officer was going to win in the state of South Carolina, for sure. South Carolinians still hated Union troops. They still had 20,000 of them occupying them. Florida's not voting for a Republican. They're part of the ex-Confederacy, and neither is Louisiana. There was absolutely no way Hayes was going to win all those legitimately. But thanks to this corrupt compromise, he did. Now, what are the Democrats going to exchange? Finally, all federal troops are withdrawn from two of those states, South Carolina and Louisiana. There was still military reconstruction and occupation going on in those states in 1876, 1877. Now the troops are gone. That puts an end to military reconstruction and really hands the South over to racist Democrats who will institute, rules that will take away the right to vote from African Americans and attempt to reinstitute what the South was like before the Civil War with Jim Crow laws and so forth. Also, something that's unheard of, some jobs, major government jobs, will be given to Democrats by President Hayes. Typically, a president only appoints fellow party members to government positions. Hayes is committed to appointing numerous Democrats to high-paying government positions. And finally, there's some money in it to construct some railroads across the South. The big losers in this, African Americans in the South. Why the Republicans did this, basically sold the farm just to have Hayes in the White House and give away everything they'd accomplished up to that point in civil liberties and rights, is beyond me. I've never read a legitimate reason for this. It makes absolutely no sense, because let's think of what the alternative was. The honest prosecutor, Sam Tilden, is president. Boy, that'd be horrible, wouldn't it? So, this is ridiculous. And it's one of the worst things that ever happened in this country. We're still paying the price for this compromise of 1877 and the harebrained decision of the Supreme Court of Plessy versus Ferguson at the end of the century. So, now we got time just to talk a little bit about what Hayes does, because it isn't much. He's going to be a one-term president. He's going to enter under precarious circumstances, and even on Inauguration Day, people are referring to him as your fraudulency, an old 8 to 7, and so forth. The big thing that's really going to happen in Hayes' administration happens right in the first year, right off the bat, in May of 1877. There's a nationwide railroad strike. Now, what's going to happen here is there's still the lingering effects of the Panic of 1873, which was a horrible depression. So, the first thing to start tipping off what's going to lead to this strike is in late May 1877, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company is going to announce that all of its employees have to take a 10% pay cut, and if they don't like it, quit. Now, the problem is, there's a union that represents these railroad workers. They have a contract that determines their wages. And when you work under a contract, one side cannot unilaterally change the contract. You would have to negotiate this. There were no negotiations. They were trying to dictate policy to union workers. About a week later, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad will make an even more stunning announcement that all of their employees will have to take a 20% pay cut. And if they don't like it, quit. Now, to give you an idea of what people made back then, railroad workers or unionized are some of the highest paid in the country. One thing you got to remember also is workers worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And the highest paid person on a railroad, on a train, was the engineer, obviously. An engineer was paid $3.25 for 12 hours work. And now they have to take either a 10 or 20% pay cut. Think they were happy? One of the lowest paid on a train and one of the hardest jobs was a fireman. Firemen were the ones who shoveled coal into the engine or threw wood if it was wood fired. Very backbreaking work. They made $1.75 for 12 hours work. Not $1.75 an hour, $1.75 for 12 hours. And they're going to have to take a 10 or 20% pay cut. So the unions that represented these workers said, no, you don't. We're going on strike. So railroad workers all across the country, whether they were subject to this pay cut or not, sided with their brothers and went out on strike because they knew they'd be next if nothing happened here. So about 80,000 railroad workers went out on strike. Very quickly, this put 500,000 factory workers out of jobs because everything was transported by rail back then. There's no tractor trailers or airplanes or anything else. Things are brought, raw materials are brought to a factory by a railroad. They're brought to markets by railroads. So another 500,000 workers are temporarily laid off during this strike. The railroad owners go to the White House and demand that the president do something about it. The president will. He will order the railroad workers to end their strike and go back to work. And when they refuse, he sends the United States Army into forcing them back to work at gunpoint. In this process, over 100 striking railroad workers are killed by our own military. This was a gigantic blow to unions, and it's going to take them decades to recover from this action by President Hayes. It's also devastating to him. He certainly will not be the favorite among any workers in America siding with the railroad owners like this. That's part of the reason why in 1880, when re-election time rolls around, Hayes basically says, I'm not interested in running for re-election. So that's it for today. When we pick up next time, we'll talk about the election of 1880 and move quickly towards turn of the century with politics. And then when we're done with politics, we're going to move to talking about cities during the Gilded Age. So, hope everybody's healthy. See you next time. Bye now.